So we're going to talk about the beginning of the end for the EUAs. So, I'm Michelle. You guys all know me, and you're getting to know Ty. Ty's my sidekick here and my grief counselor in training. And then those of you who follow me on LinkedIn are familiar with my executive team, and the boss man is supervising right now. So, sorry, my things are going a little nutty here. So stay calm and carry on. The FDA issued 2 draft guidances at the end of December. One was for the enforcement policies, which are the actual guidance documents the FDA issued, and one was for the EUAs. So what's the difference is the enforcement policy allows for certain low-risk products to be imported and distributed in the US without advance FDA approval. There are a total of 28 enforcement policy guidances, whereas the emergency use authorization allows previously unapproved medical products to be used during a public health emergency. And so this is like higher risk products, and there's about 900 of these issued, and they are product and company specific. The enforcement policy remains in effect throughout the PHE, whereas the emergency use authorization does require submission to the FDA, but it's significantly less of a burden than the 510K process, both in terms of timeline and of testing. Once the emergency is over, products under the enforcement policy need to meet all applicable FDA requirements to remain on the market. And then for the EUAs, once the emergency is over, they must receive a full 510K market clearance to remain on the market. So footnotes, very important. These guidance, of course, the FDA says that these guidances are only recommendations unless regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. That they also say the word of should as something that is suggested or recommended but not required. We all know that that is a joke. If you are not going to do something that the FDA says in a guidance document, you better have a really good rationale or a better way of doing it. And then it's also important, there are 98 footnotes between these 2 guidance documents that radically change the interpretation of what you thought you read in the actual text. So be sure to take note of the footnotes. They're not just side comments for context. And a disclaimer, this information, this presentation, it is current to my understanding of the FDA publications as of March 3rd this year. But of course, this is subject to change at any minute based off of the FDA interpretation without notice, because they constantly say things like they would clarify what we said, and then it totally changes the meaning of what they said. So there is the FDA is proposing a 3-phase transition plan. Of course, the guiding principles of both the FDA's plans are to facilitate the continued access to devices in an orderly and transparent fashion. They say it is a risk-based approach, and the FDA may still at any time take action on a company, and they have the right to revoke or revise any of the policies or EUAs. So a big question to me is why 2 separate documents? And we're going to get to what I feel is the root of that shortly. But especially because most of the material is redundant, and there's only a handful of EUA specific requirements that are different between the enforcement policy and the EUA. So devices under the enforcement policy and the EUA, if you do not plan to continue distribution beyond the transition phase, there are basically 4 types of devices and divisions that it talks about. For single-use devices or life-sustaining, life-supporting devices and IVDs, you have to remain, they can remain distributed until they are consumed. If they are reusable, non-life supporting, life sustaining, they can remain used and distributed if they are restored to their cleared or approved version, or you have labeling that is publicly available that describes the features and that the device lacks FDA clearance or approval. If they are reusable, life-supporting, life-sustaining, then they can remain used and distributed if they are restored to their previously cleared version, or they have a publicly available and physical copy of the labeling that describes the features that the device with those features lacks the FDA clearance or approval. Then IVDs that are cleared underneath the EUA can remain distributed for 2 years or until the expiration date, whichever is less. And we all know the IVDs, the only IVDs cleared are COVID tests, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. So what the FDA is proposing for the policy products, so this is that group of 28 policies and guidance documents that they issued, is a 3-phased approach with a 180-day transition period that will begin at the implementation date, and the end of that date, the list 1 guidance documents are withdrawn. So we have 2 hypothetical timelines. If the FDA issues the final guidance of this proposed guidance, and let's say hypothetically that comes in December, and the PHE expires after the issuance of the final guidance, then phase 1 will begin at the issuance of the PHE expiration. So that means that according to this timeline, the industry has 90 days between the PHE expiration and to implement their phase 2. And then phase 3 is going to begin another 90 days after that. So that is your total of 180 days. However, if the PHE expires before the final guidance is issued, then the FDA is requiring is allowing has to allow by this guidance document, they have to allow at least 45 days before phase 1 is required to begin. It could be longer. We don't know what the final guidance is going to say, but it has to be at least 45 days. Then you have phase 2. You're going to have 90 days to phase 2, and then another 190 days for a total of 180 to phase 3. So what is list 1? List 1 is those 28 enforcement policies. Again, this is just some of the more significant ones. Most of these are going to require a submission to FDA at the end of phase 2. So the big question is, how many fingers am I really holding up here in this transition plan that's supposedly 3 phases? Well, the answer is I really only see 2 at the end of the day. The implementation date, and you have to submit the notification of intent for EUAs now, like ASAP, like it is like when the implementation date is, the FDA expects you to be ready to submit your notification of intent immediately. At this point, you're supposed to follow 21 CFR Part 803 for adverse events reporting. And then during phase 1, and it says preferably before, you need to begin your bench testing, submit your pre-submissions, and start your trials to avoid missing the phase 2 deadline. Now, remember, we have to do all of this, and we are on a 90-day timeline at this point. And then depending on your technology, you still are not going to make it across the finish line because, as you all know, any type of bench testing and just even the timeline for a pre-submission can well exceed 90 days. So at the point phase 2 begins, for the enforcement policies, not the EUAs, you're supposed to submit your notification of intent, even if you're not intending to distribute the product after the transition period. So, and again, tricky language during phase 2, but preferably before. you're supposed to follow 21 CFR 806 for corrections and removals and 807 for registration and listing. So at phase 2, FDA expects your marketing submissions are submitted and accepted. So this means you've made it through RTA, which RTA alone takes 15 days. So you need to back up at least 15 days on your 90 days to make it through the RTA process. And then at this point, all regulatory requirements must be implemented. This means you have to follow 21 CFR 820 in phase 2 at the same time that you're putting together your submission to the FDA. And then phase 3 begins at the end of another 90 days, and FDA is going to withdraw all the list 1 enforcement policies. So basically, at the start of phase 3, in the industry who intends to continue to market their products, and even some that remain in distribution, have to be in full compliance with all regulatory requirements. And so all activities in phase 3 are just the FDA. And so the FDA graciously is saying that they do not intend to object to continued distribution if your submission is in and has been accepted while they are reviewing your submission. And all of this is supposed to happen in 180 days. But this timeline is even more complicated for the EUAs because of some tricky language. And this is the answer to the first question about why are there 2 guidance documents for the EUAs versus the enforcement policy? Well, the EUAs are issued by HHS, which is, of course, FDA's boss. They're not issued by FDA. And so the HHS is responsible for publication in the Federal Register. And so the timeline in the EUAs is dependent on the HHS publishing the notice in that Federal Register. Whereas the guidance documents or the policies are issued directly by the FDA, so they're more in control of those products and those timelines. To further complicate it, the line 109 of the draft says this guidance contemplates, so they're thinking about that the advance notice of the termination of the EUAs will be published in the federal. So they just think FDA is thinking, because they don't know what the HHS is going to really do, that the HHS is going to give 180 days notice before the EUA is terminated. So at this point, they are just waxing philosophical on the transition plan and timeline. So the EUAs may have even less time to comply if HHS publishes the expiration and it's less than 180 days. So what about this notification of intent? The FDA is calling it an EUA report. You have to notate it as attention notification of intent. The content is broken down into general information about your company and your product, your future plans to market. If you plan on making a submission, you have to tell the FDA. If you are not planning to make a submission, you need to, in that notification, you have to describe your plans to discontinue or restore your devices. And so the whole purpose of the notification of intent is, and it's why the FDA is requiring it both ways, is because this is how they're going to use it for their planning purposes, to know what their workload and their burden is going to be at the end of that 90 days. As if in 90 days, they could put together the resources to handle the onslaught of submissions that are coming. So the notification of intent is even more complicated because the timeline is not aligned between the two. The EUA guidances are say to submit as soon as possible after the guidance is finalized, whereas the enforcement policies say to submit before the start of phase 2, which is the first 90 days. And what's the purpose of that? So these are the devices that require the notification of intent. This table is in both of the transition guidance documents, but in one of them, they have this code QOO for tubing and connector co-venting in the EUA transition guidance, but it's not in the enforcement policy guidance. And so that's confusing. We weren't sure if it was a typo or an oversight. So where does that leave industry in their path moving forward? Well, if you're not going to distribute after list 1 is withdrawn, you still have to refer to that phased approach of implementing the requirements for the CFRs. But some of this is intended only for products that are going to remain on the market. So if you are in that reusable product space, you're going to have different requirements than if your product is going to be consumed. You still need to submit your notification of intent, and you will be expected to comply with all those regulatory requirements once again. So drop dead deadlines that you need to keep in mind is on the EUA termination date. If you've not submitted a marketing submission and had it submitted by the FDA beforehand, before the beginning of phase 3, if the manufacturer has not submitted a marketing submission, and then on the date you receive a negative submission on your FDA, the 510K or de novo. And then on the date that you withdraw said submission, if you have a bunch of additional information requests that you think are too burdensome. So for these devices, if you do plan to continue distribution and you want to ride this train, well, your 510K submission has to include a transition implementation plan that has all of the information about how you intend to handle your products that were marketed under the EUA versus the products you're going to market underneath your accepted 510K. In that transition plan, you have to talk about what if that 510K is denied, and you have to talk about what is going to happen if that 510K is approved, and you get to go to market and to commercialization. So what's the difference in the notification of intent versus the transition plan? Well, both of them have the same requirements for general information, except for the transition implementation plan also requires you to specify your number of devices in distribution. Your future plans of notification is in the notification only, and this is like where you tell the FDA that you plan to make a 510K or de novo. Future plans, kind of phase 2, is in both, and this is the plans for the devices that remain in distribution. And then finally, the transition implementation plan also requires you to make a benefit risk discussion around how the notification of the stakeholders and the change to the regulatory status and your timeline for doing so. So additional considerations is, again, you're going to have to comply with all of the CFRs that are relevant for your product. Manufacturers may request exemption, and they have to do this by a formal process with the FDA, and they have to do it 90 days in advance of the expiration. So, and the reason why FDA, the condition is for non-traditional manufacturers. So these are the people who were making like bed sheets and mattresses that all of a sudden decided that they were going to make surgical masks, and they may not have a full quality management system. So FDA still has the rights to enter and inspect any warehouse or factory during this period of time. But what about that COVID testing? Only one of the two guidances talks about COVID, and one of them says that in a footnote, remember those 98 footnotes, that the COVID tests are specifically outside of the enforcement policy transition guidance, but there's not a similar statement in the EUA transition. and it doesn't speak directly to them, except for it has an example of how the timeline would apply to a COVID test. So it makes it really confusing about, does that guidance document apply to COVID test or not? So there is no other information outside of that one example. So questions and challenges related to this transition. What about devices that are known to need clinical data to support the indication? Even if a manufacturer is in active clinical trials now, they likely won't have enough data and a completed trial to put in their submission. So what is FDA's plan for these products that are trying to get the data they need, but it's not physically possible to do so in the 180 days? You can't complete a clinical trial. When filing your submission through eCopy, where do you post the transition implementation plan so that both the eCopy and the RTA requirements are met? And, at best, eCopy is finicky and extremely tricky to get through at times. There's very specific naming conventions, very specific file and folder structures. They even see ghost files on your flash drive. And so, a transition implementation plan could be added into the cover letter. It could be added as an appendix. And so the FDA is going to be playing Where's Waldo with where these transition implementation plans even are, if you make it past eCopy with it. So what about your registration and listing? Manufacturers are being told to register in phase 2 before receiving their market clearance, because remember, at phase 3, that's when FDA starts reviewing submissions. But you can't list a device without a valid submission number from your clearance and approval letter. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? How are you going to conduct a registration and listing with no number? So I know this because I had to ask DICE during the early on in COVID. My customer wanted to register some masks that they were making underneath one of the policies. And so we had to email the FDA because you cannot complete a registration listing without a submission number. And we were told to type the word enforcement in the box where you would normally put that submission number. And then that all of a sudden opens up the next screen, which would otherwise kind of have dulled out boxes for you to check. But if you put that word enforcement on the next screen, you can see, you can now check the box on your submission number. Oh, and another funny thing about this, when I was on the FDA call and I got to ask a question, I asked the FDA, how do they intend for companies to complete this given these requirements? And they literally told me there are instructions on device advice on how to complete registration and listings. And do you know what the instructions say? They say you cannot complete a registration listing without a cleared number. So clearly the FDA has never completed a registration and listing to know that this was a problem. So the unknown unknowns for these guidance documents is for products that have to submit their notification of intent. Is the agency going to provide feedback on the adequacy of that notification of intent to be able to incorporate into their subsequent transition implementation plans? So the FDA indicated that manufacturers in this phase should do a pre-sub, but that doesn't fit within that transition guideline. A standard pre-sub, if you want an actual call with the agency, can take up to 120 of your 180 days. And of course, while you can be preparing your submission in the background, the results of your pre-submission are going to affect the contents of your submission. So how are you going to do your pre-submission and your submission and have your RTA done before phase 3 starts? So in phase 1, you have to do essentially nothing. because that's all that's mentioned in the guidance is to follow Part 803. And for the bulk of these products, that was the only requirement for during this entire grace period allowed by the EUAs. So why has the FDA not in phase 1 talked about testing and submissions? And again, it's just redundant requirements. And why at this point are they specifying only one of the CFRs that should have already been in place, which is one of the easier ones to meet? So a question for the FDA is, why repeat the requirements and give over 90 days to comply? Industry would be better served a more realistic approach, 180 days to implement even 21 CFR and other requirements. The FDA is identifying, prioritizing the subsystems into phases. So if the FDA suggested, okay, we understand implementing the entire CFR for 820 is a big task. Here, like in phase 1, let's start with design controls and then start building out from there on a quality management system implementation plan. And again, is this just a get out of jail free clause for those companies who had been marketing under the EUA but hadn't complied with the only requirement that was subject to those devices? So phase 2, let's do it all. And this is time, and now we worked to stay calm and carry on. And now we're just gonna freak out and panic because we have to do literally all the things all at one time now. So at this point, at phase 2, it says FDA expects the marketing submissions to be submitted and accepted. All your regulatory requirements have to be met. And then phase 3 begins. And all this is supposed to happen in 90 days. You need to meet all the regulatory requirements. Your pre-submissions have to be complete. Your submissions must be in. They must be through RTA. And then if you're not going to continue distribution, at this point, you need to modify your products in the field. And you still have to implement all the requirements that are applicable to your devices. So why is this timeline so condensed? And, you know, it's very tricky. And when Ty and I were building this presentation, we were reading and rereading, you know, the guidance documents a dozen times. And the first time I gave it, the day beforehand, we unraveled all this nonsense about the timeline, because if you read what happens in phase 3 for industry, every sentence starts with tricky words about before the start of, well in advance of. And do you know what well in advance of could mean? Phase 1. You know, why don't they just say this instead of putting these requirements where it looks like they're happening in phase 2? Why don't they really put them in the phase in which they belong or are expected? So phase 3, here you're just in a hurry up and wait because the FDA has withdrawn all your policies, the EUAs are expired, and at this point you're waiting on the submission clock. So, you know, a normal, the FDA clock, once you pass your RTA, is 90 days. So with an onslaught of submissions that all have to be in the day that phase 3 begins, or 15 days before if you're going to meet your RTA, do you really think FDA is going to hit 90 days for your submission review? I don't think so. So yeah, you made it across the finish line just to wait in line. So COVID-19 testing, this is like the middle child that gets no attention. The status is at best unclear. What do you do with your stock that is in your physical possession? Is it dead or is it viable for the 2 years that the guidance specifies? It's also unclear if manufacturers can continue to manufacture those COVID tests, not just their stock. And there's no clarification in the guidance. And then per the FDA's webinar, they said the situation is very fluid. So keep an eye on all those future guidance documents and attend all the FDA COVID town halls to know what the FDA is going to plan for these. So this is another area where it's really important to have your say. industry should let the FDA know what your opinion is on these guidance documents. Particularly, the FDA wants to know from industry if this 180-day transition period before the FDA withdraws the guidance documents is adequate. And then they also want to know what guidance documents need to be or products need to be in that list 1. You have to submit your comments by March 23rd, 2022. So it's really important to review these guidance documents and submit your comments to the Federal Register next week. The docket number for the policies is here. And you'll get a link to this presentation. You can go straight to the docket, and then you have instructions here as well on how to upload your comments. So on the EUA transition guidance, again, they want you to comment on that 180-day transition period and whether FDA's issuance of this guidance with proposed transition policy. Again, you have to comment within March 23rd. It has a separate guidance, separate docket number. So make sure that you post to both dockets. And there are so many more questions that are raised in these. So do read them for yourself. But these that we brought up are the heaviest hitters with the biggest impact to the accessibility to these products. I have also drafted a letter where I just suggest that what you should say to the FDA. Feel free to take that and adapt it with your own thoughts and opinions, but it'll at least get you started, and then upload it to the dockets. So the takeaway to anybody who has a product that is currently in distribution under the EUAs is start now. Even these guidance documents are still in draft. The FDA's timeline isn't realistic. Even if they adjust it, it's not likely to be a lot more friendly given the work that there is to do. And the FDA will not be lenient with that timeline. So don't wait and get started. So, now we'll take questions and talk about how we can help you with this transition period.
One thing that you can do is the letter is also available on the website, on Lean RAQA's website under the news section, if you're wondering where you can get it. And the copy of the presentations will be available under recording. Okay, let me go ahead and promote Verna so she can ask her question. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. So my questions, with all of this going through right now, obviously a year ago, everything was backed up. I'm assuming that even now things are going to be still backed up based on just all the stuff they got to go through with transitioning. So do you have any idea or experience with what the FDA is saying for non-COVID products that are trying to go through 510K?
All depends on the review division. If it is a review division that is impacted by COVID, it doesn't matter if your product's COVID or not COVID. Like we did a 513G and we did a 513G instead of a pre-sub because it has a fee and the FDA is supposed to prioritize work that they get paid for, right, as opposed to the pre-submission is in EUAs are free. But it was a IVD test, not COVID related. Yeah. 513G timeline is supposed to be like 60, 75 days. It was 10 months. And then the client finally just decided to withdraw it because they still didn't have an answer from FDA.
And that was the only time that we got any feedback.
Wow. And so that was even like, now was that, it was an IVD, but it was because they were impacted by
because they were impacted by all the EUA tests, the COVID tests.
So you think about anything cardiology, right, any IVD, respiratory,
general surgical because of all the masks, and
Oh,
accessory
general
devices.
surgical. I was going to say, yeah, because what if, like, how about something unrelated, like orthopedic products? But
Yeah, see, exactly. Any implants, any of that, I think should flow pretty, but unless FDA took the resources from those divisions and reassigned them to the higher impacted ones.
yeah,
So, and this is where I also think the notification of intents are a little bit of a joke. It's like, how's the FDA going to staff in 90 days once they get these notification of intents? It's just enough time to go, oh shit.
What's also really interesting about the notification of intents is that they're meant to be used for life-sustaining, life-supporting devices. That's typically what's on that list.
right.
But they haven't said what to do for anyone who doesn't have a product code. So if you're going in with a de novo, but you're life-supporting and life-sustaining, it's not clear whether or not you need to submit a notification of intent. And it's not clear if FDA is going to give you any feedback on what is an appropriate transition plan for you, because that would be the useful mechanism for that.
De novos are a huge effort. Like, how are you going to write a de novo in 90 days, even 180 days, to get all your data and to prepare a de novo submission? It's just, I don't think it's just not possible.
Well, I found with clients, it's like the industry now is like, oh, okay, we're ready to get back to work and innovate and all that. But for folks who are in startups that have never gone through the FDA, they're like in a completely different like universe, right? They're just, FDA, sorry, we're still back in COVID land. And startups are like, oh, let's get going. We got the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I'm thinking like, unless it's like something that's in the area of, say, like opioid pain reduction, I mean, stuff where people feel like, okay, just as important as COVID, we're going to try to get, I'm thinking like, unless this is something that the FDA feels like is life-saving health improvement for the country, that's maybe on the level of COVID, I'm thinking like, you might be just listening to crickets for a long time. Okay, just wanted your perspective. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Comments?
We covered a lot of information. This was a really complicated set of guidance documents. Michelle and I had to read it seriously for 2 weeks, and like we would call each other after work and be like, did you read this line? It completely is different. It's different than what we thought.
Every day our interpretation changed.
Yeah, there's a lot of information here, and honestly, for anyone who has a product that has an EUA authorization, it's not very helpful. You have no idea if you're going to have, the 180 days proposed timelines. FDA hasn't said anything. So does anyone else want to have, hold on. I see Nellis has raised their hands. Let me promote you, Nellie.
Excellent presentation. I have to tell you, not being a regulatory person, it's like overwhelming. And I actually work for a company who's a COVID company. I won't get into politics. Maybe I'll call you later, Michelle.
I'll get a cocktail for it.
Yeah, get a cocktail. But the challenge of it is the scenario that my client does is they don't actually manufacture the kits. Mm-hmm. They take somebody else's EU kits, put their labeling on it, and then it goes through their portal for their lab. How do I, and I think it's maybe I introduce you, Michelle, to Fiona, and you guys have a conversation, because that's a whole regulatory strategy that is above and beyond what I'm even able to thread out. But that's what I'm kind of wondering, because how do you mix that into the mix for that?
Yeah. Well, and that's complicated, because every company that's issued an IVD company that's issued an EUA letter has specific instructions that they have to pass on to their distributors or the people who are labeling it like this. So that's something else. I'm going to be super curious. The FDA thought to include that in the authorization letter that's company specific, but how are they going to think to include that in the whenever they finally publish what they're thinking for the guidance on the test kits?
Yeah. So I may be reaching out to you, and my advice when I reach out to you with this client is just talk to them briefly, but remember that they're a challenging company because they've never been in med device as senior management, and they jumped in during COVID. And so there you go. I don't have to say anymore, do I have to, Michelle?
No, that's why I made the joke about the people who were manufacturing mattresses before me. I talked to several of those people during the transition.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And then we're gonna be able to get this information, and I can share it with my friend Fiona. I'm probably gonna introduce you to her. But yeah, I don't even know what to say, because it's like, it seems like they're setting themselves up to fail. So that was my perception of it. It's like, you're really just setting everybody up to fail. Another situation where everything's bogged down.
The EUA, the 2 guidance documents too are very unfriendly to anyone who is new to medical devices in general, because they prioritize language that says revert to, a previously cleared version of the device. And way back in the time machine, they started having the town halls for, PPE and for the COVID diagnostic tests. And even on the PPE town halls, they would say, we really meant for EUAs to bring cleared devices in other markets, like from Europe, into the US, not for all of these new manufacturers to try their hand at medical devices. And so the transition plan, it takes months to implement 21 CFR 820. And when you read the examples, it says in the examples that the company continues to follow 21 CFR 820 in phase 1, which that means that they've had it the whole time, because,
and most of them have it.
Yeah, most don't have it at all.
Yeah. And you think I've been doing this 20 years, Ty's been doing it 10. So, between us, it took us reading it basically from December until February to figure out what the hell that they were saying.
It was so bad. We have like our printed hard copies are sitting right here for me, because I couldn't read it on the computer.
Yeah.
To make sense of it.
As any true regulatory people are still paper-based, because it's just.
So what advice would you have me give to the company that's basically a distributor?
Do they want to do this for reals when they grow up?
I think they're trying to do different products that goes through this typical 510K approval process. Let me ask it this way instead. In the scenario where I told you that they're taking an already approved EUA, they're putting their labeling on it, going through their portal, are they a relabeler or are they still a distributor? What's the classification? That would be the best. Because they're putting in their box and they're putting their labeling in it, but their labeling matches the EUA labeling so that they're in alignment. It's all to redirect them to the client's portal.
That's a great question. I think they might be a relabeler, and if they are, in that case, it especially since they're the ones doing the labeling. Like if the other company was shipping it to them with their name on it and the whole 9 yards, that would be one thing. But if they're actually repackaging, I need to relook at the definition of relabeler to properly answer that. But in that case, they're going to have to register and list with the FDA if that is the case. And that's going to be, $6,000 a year.
And they have to put in requirements and quality management system, that they might not have had.
Well, that's why they hired me. And it's been very slow because of the demands of distribution. And so we've got a quality plan and everything all drafted. But and when I looked at the definition, Michelle, I landed on relabeler, just so you're aware.
Yeah.
I wanted a second opinion because they disagreed with me. And so no, let's talk. We're a distributor. And I'm like, no, I think we're a relabeler. And
no, I'm pretty sure if they actually do it themselves, I think Michelle is right. That is what.
I'm pretty sure you're right as well. But it's just, it's interesting what's popped up as a result of COVID and the difference, the education of like, when we usually get a new client, I do this really slow education because they're starting in early design control. So by the time we ever get to the point where we're doing 510K submissions, they've learned about QMS. They know. Where with the COVID, they've all popped up and they've not known, and it's like bath by fire.
Yep.
So okay, that's my question. I may call you later, Michelle.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, yeah. Call me either way.
All right. Thanks, Nellie. Verna, I invited you back because I think that what you put is fascinating to talk about.
Yeah, so it just popped into my head like, okay, we're all, US focused, and of course we have plenty of living in the US, plenty of complaints about, FDA's thinking around things. But I thought, so what's going on in Europe? I mean, obviously this is a pandemic. So what is Europe doing around, and what have they done? I had no idea in terms of, emergency devices for COVID.
It's my understanding, I don't know, but this is the extent of my understanding, is that each country in Europe had their own separate EUA process. It wasn't like one as a whole, because there are over 23 health authorities there.
Yeah, I think there's 24 competent authorities, I think.
Yeah. Because I thought like, oh, but we've switched to MDR, so it should be regulation across the whole. But wait, but it's pretty recent still. So like,
yeah, and the notified bodies have to be designated to issue certificates, and there's no designation for emergency use. So yeah, and maybe Luke you can promote Luke, and he can speak to this. Like, I don't know how it's working over there.
I just asked him.
What are your thoughts, Ty?
I think it's weird that, MDR is coming out. FDA just published its intent to align with ISO 1345. Yes. And so we have this pandemic that's going on, but we're having huge, massive regulatory overhauls at the same time. And I think Europe,
that was a good idea.
Right.
Hey, Lou.
It was a great idea.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Just a moment. I was following you on my bike because we are not into we're not into summertime yet, daylight saving time. So I only thought that only the EU was setting in realistic timelines, but it seems like also the FDA does it.
Yeah.
What are they doing? Was I correct? Or is every country individually issue EUA, or how's that work?
Yes, it's individually, but I don't know many companies who make use of the arrangements. So like the company I now work for, they made ventilators under EUA, but only for a few months, and they went straight for full compliance. So
smart.
And that way they were able to produce even 20,000 of ventilators more and could sell them around Europe without many problems.
How was the MDR process for them? Was it better because they had an EUA?
No, what happened was in the beginning of COVID, many of their clients, they thought that there would be a big recession, so they held off all orders. Mm-hmm. And also some clients who were expecting some deliveries were said, can you please hold off? And they would say, oh, it's for COVID. Okay, it's okay, we hold off. And then everybody helped. Like they got first in line at the test house, first in line at the notified body, and that way they were able to make it under the MDR. Mm. But I don't know many companies who make use of the emergency use things in Europe because it's so complicated. And I still think that with in May 2024, there will be a huge avalanche of products coming at the notified bodies for certification. Oh, yeah. And all the companies here still think that if they knock on the door of the notified bodies in April 2024, that they can get things done. So I still expect the EU to have a pragmatic solution for that. So, something like in the line of, say, everything that's already in line for certification, you may still sell it until the notified bodies have gone rid of the waiting line.
That would be,
Something like that.
that's FDA's approach right now. That's what they're doing with the EUAs. If you're in line, you're going to be able to sell it. But the difference with FDA is at least it's the government body with notified bodies. They still answer to the competent authorities. Are the competent authorities going to let them do that?
So, and Luke, to your point about the timeline and people, I lost a potentially big customer recently because when they came to me, they had like this whole assessment form and I had to fill out like how I was qualified for all these little things, which is fine. But one of their things is, do you have the resources to guarantee that we can get a CE mark under the MDR for a 2B decision-making software by May of 23? And I was like,
23?
I have the resource. I said, let me ask you this. Have you called a notified body yet? Even just called them. And they're like, no. And I'm like, no, I cannot guarantee. I can guarantee you I'll get the documentation done. I can't even guarantee you're going to be able to get in line at the notified body by May of 23. And so they chose somebody else because they said, we chose somebody that would better fit our timeline. I'm like, oh, so you chose somebody that lied to you. Yeah,
Probably.
Yeah.
They're not sharing.
yeah, it's supposed to be fast, right?
Do you have any
more than
idea how big
cocktails
the
that are
market-
needed.
sorry.
What, Luke?
Do you have any idea how big the market is for emergency use products?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to guess that the COVID diagnostic test EUA takes up the bulk of that market, that would be really the ticket. And we still, in the US, there's one, the first de novo and the only de novo, I guess, was cleared for the PCR test. And then they followed up with a 510K using their de novo as a predicate. So there's two versions of a PCR test that's been cleared here, but no rapid test has been cleared yet through the de novo process. And so, oh, look at that. So cute. New puppy.
Yep. I'm sorry.
Oh, cute. Looks like a young one. And so I think that part of the reason the COVID-19 tests are just not being addressed is that FDA doesn't know how to, or is either setting such a high standard for those tests that the first de novo is going to break industry and it's going to be a monopoly, or
and what are you going to do? Is everybody going to be submitting a de novo? And then what happens when the first de novo gets granted with all the other de novos that are in the process that should now be 510Ks?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, but yeah, because it's like everybody's.
Well, and for non-IVD products, I was told some stupid things by the FDA during the review of some EUAs. I was working on a alternative to a ventilator, like it was ideally going to make it to where you didn't have to get on a ventilator. And it was a closed circuit that just was a unique way of putting already cleared devices together. So technically this should fit within what they intended, but they told me, and this was in August, was it August 2020? Right. It was in the height of the pandemic in Arizona, because this company is based in Arizona too.
Yeah, it was
we got very far down the EUA process. So far, I thought it was going to be granted. And then at the end, they came back and said, the FDA is unaware of a continued lack of access to ventilators. And in the areas of the country that are still spiking, people can be life flighted to other areas of the country that still have ventilators. I just was speechless. My brother had to be life flighted for 20 minutes from a hospital to a hospital, and that was like $100,000. Like,
the
one
thing I could think of is that trying to speak for the FDA, maybe that the problem wasn't so much lack of ventilators, but although it was the height of the pandemic, but it was more a lack of healthcare resources to support ventilators. because I'd read in some cases that was quite a bit of a problem. It's like, well, you could give us a lot of ventilators. We don't even have enough healthcare people that are trained and to monitor people, but I don't know.
Yeah. I was told the same thing about ECMO devices. That one got so far, it was a alternative to an ECMO that would repurposed blood transfusion. With kidney dialysis, that's what it did. It repurposed a kidney dialysis machine. And they're like, hey, we think this is really cool. You should submit for a breakthrough. And we're like, all right. And you're like, okay, if the FDA tells me to submit a breakthrough, this is going well, right?
Yeah.
We get the feedback on the breakthrough. They only ask 2 very simple questions. And we're like, oh, we've got this made. They come back and they say, we are unaware of a lack of access to ECMO. So therefore, we're denying your breakthrough. And I'm like, your guidance document on ECMO starts with, there is a lack of access to ECMO machines.
Did you tell them that? Like,
and I'm like, and they're like, well, so it's like, okay, for me, I think the FDA mentally withdrew a lot of these guidance documents, and they're just for paper or show now because they can't legally, with all that's going on still with COVID, they can't just flat out say, hey, we don't really think that this is a problem.
And I think that
maybe they just don't even have the resources.
I don't think that's what I think it is. I think they didn't have the resources to consider anything that could be, a real proper breakthrough or de novo or anything. Although they did just publish, or a couple months ago, publish their breakthrough metrics. For once, I saw them in the device land and I was like, oh, this is new. Program's been out for 5 years and you actually published something about it. But I don't know. I found that stuff personally insulting since I have family members that are healthcare providers, and one of them works in New Mexico, and Albuquerque is the only tier 1 hospital that they have for that entire population. At least in Tucson, we have a mega city, Phoenix, nearby, but my brother has nothing. Like, they fly people from Albuquerque to Phoenix because there's no bigger hospital. And then we have the Navajo Nation, which is so underserved.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, yeah, there's just not, there's actually parts of the country here that are just healthcare infrastructure is,
it just doesn't exist.
Completely inadequate. So yeah. So let's just throw it out and say, okay, well, there's no hospital that's saying that they need ventilators. So we think that there's not a need for them.
Yeah.
Any last questions, thoughts, 2 cents? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And with that, this is my last speech on the EUAs for this particular presentation, because the comment period closes again March 22nd. So go to my website, get the letter. And with that, I'm throwing these in the trash.
They might come back to haunt you, though.
Okay. Have a good day, everybody.